Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of Any Questions. It's encouraging to see such a good turnout tonight. A couple of housekeeping issues to begin with. Lavatories are through the back door on the right, across the foyer, through the next door, and you'll find them on the left. Exits, well, essentially by the way that you came in. Now, this is something of a red letter occasion for us, as it represents the relaunch of Any Questions after the pandemic lockdowns and restrictions of the past couple of years. And we now have a firm programme in place for future meetings. It's some 7 years ago now since the group was originally set up, very much of the instigation of David Edgington, who was convinced of the need for a forum where Christians and others could get together and discuss topics of importance and relevance to faith in an open and in a questioning way. Sadly, David died last year, but right up to a couple of days beforehand, he was exploring ways and means of restarting and trying to relocate speakers. So I imagine he's looking down this quite benignly this evening, and maybe he's wishing that he were here to fire the first question. It's a real pleasure to welcome this evening Major General Tim Cross to speak on the subject of can a Christian serve in the military? A topic, of course, of particular relevance in these turbulent times worldwide. Tim has had a very distinguished military career, serving at various times in some of the major conflicts and trouble spots of the world. And he now speaks and lectures widely, serves his local church as a lay minister, and he's bold to declare publicly his Christian faith and commitment. After his presentation, he's happy to take questions. So over to you, Tim, please.
Thanks very much, David. So let me just see whether or not we can get this to work. There we go. There we go. That's me. That's me. Thank you very much indeed, Dave. And so funny enough, we resurrected a thing we call Speaker's Corner on Friday of last week, which I was actually involved in setting up again. that, like any questions here, had died a death during COVID. And our first speaker was Michael Gove, the MP, so I'm afraid you got second best. I wondered if you might say that. So, like all good military men, I've got a mission tonight. My mission is to speak to you for about 35-40 minutes. There's a clock at the back which I can hardly see, so I'll try to keep an eye on the time. But if I'm going on beyond about 20 to 8, somebody needs to start waving and let me know that we need to bring it to land. So I'm going to speak about 35-40 minutes on, can you be a Christian in the military? And I want to do that by laying out something of my background and my military life and some of the issues that I come across. And then hopefully that will stimulate a good question and answer period. And I know from some of the others that there are one or two difficult questions already being framed to challenge me on what I'm about to say.
Sorry, can I pass you on you? I do apologise for being so rude, but my father's certainly here. I don't know if anyone else can't hear very well, and you're moving away from the microphone.
Well, I've got a mic on here, so maybe...
It's not really you are the same.
Okay, let me just check whether I probably didn't turn it on. That probably didn't help much, did it? Let's have a go at that, see whether that makes any difference. How's that? Does that switch over? That make any difference? You can probably hear now. Okay, now the danger is, could we make sure this mic is off, because otherwise I'm going to get feedback when I sit, and I'll spend quite a lot of time standing there. So thank you for reminding us of that. And now your mission, there are two caveats to what I'm about to say. Your mission is to listen and then give me a hard time during questions. And if you decide that you've finished your mission before I finish mine, then please snore quietly or gently leave and let the rest of us proceed. And then secondly is to manage your expectations. Whenever I do a lecture from in the military environment or the civilian environment, I always use this quote from H.G. Wells, which I love. And H.G. Wells is reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. So that's me. I'm not going to be talking from an intellectual point of view. I'm hopefully going to be talking from a very practical point of view. But I should add that H.G. Wells is reputed to have met Stalin once and left thinking Stalin was a nice bloke. So maybe I don't have to worry too much. So a little bit of my background and the journey that I was on as I joined the military. I joined as an Army cadet first of all in 1964. My father retired at Somerset, and I should have said earlier on that I've got my big brother sitting in the front here. He's going to give me a hard time if this doesn't go well, so he's kind to me. So my dad retired, or our dad retired at Somerset in the early 1960s, 61, 62, and I joined as an Army cadet in 1964, barely 20 years after D-Day. And looking around the room, most of you will remember those days, a very different military, much, much bigger, of course. And we wore uniform, hitchhiked around the country, and people would pick us up, and bus drivers wouldn't charge us, and cinemas wouldn't charge us to go in, and so on and so forth. It's really all I wanted to do. I was not academic, as H.G. Wells would agree with, but I was certainly not academic at school, so all I ever wanted to be was in the military. And I went to sign up in Bristol as a soldier, joined the Somerset Cornwall Light Infantry, and there a captain, a guy called King, convinced me to try to go for a commission in the army. I went to an army college in 1967 to study A-levels, which I passed 3 at the lowest possible grade. I honestly don't think I would get in the army today in terms of the academic qualifications that are necessary. But I did 2 years there, and then 2 years at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst, and I was commissioned in 1971. And like everybody else in those days, of course, Northern Ireland was running hot, and so I spent time in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. In my case, I was what's called an ammunition technical officer, so I used to do bomb disposal work in Northern Ireland, dealing with the terrorist devices that the Catholics and indeed the Protestants were throwing around at the time. I then did 4 tours in Germany during the Cold War years. Remember in those days the Soviet Union on the other side of the inner German border? You remember that? There was West Germany and East Germany. And of course, this is what's going on at the moment with Russia and Ukraine, rather brings back some of the memories of those years. But we had a very big army commitment to NATO had over 23,000 main battle tanks deployed in Germany and nearly 5,000 combat aircraft ready to fight and engage with the Warsaw Pact, who were estimated to have about 51,000 main battle tanks and about 6,000 combat aircraft, who we believe, genuinely believe, particularly in the 1980s, could have come across the inner German border at very short notice. So it was a serious business. We look back on it now, and thankfully, of course, we didn't have to fight. But nonetheless, at the time, it was a pretty serious business. And I did 4 tours there, and 3 of them was a captain, and then a company commander, and then a commanding officer of a particular battalion based in Germany. I then served in Cyprus in the 1980s with the United Nations, 7 years after the Turkish invasion. And it was there in Cyprus on Easter Sunday, 1981, actually a visit to Jerusalem that my wife and I went on, my 30th birthday, visited Jerusalem, went to the Garden Tomb. I don't know whether anybody's heard of the Garden Tomb. And as a result of that, became a Christian in 1981. I was a young captain at the time. The 1990s were a decade dominated by the Balkans. You remember the Balkans Wars, the ethnic cleansing that went on in the early 1990s. And I did 3 tours of the Balkans, initially with the implementation force that went into Bosnia, and then the sustainment force, and then the Kosovo operation called KFOR, and I commanded a brigade at that point, and got heavily involved in the massive refugee crisis that was going on in Kosovo at the time, and maybe touch on that a little bit later. And then in the 21st century, as we turn through to the 2000s, of course September the 11th happened, and then the Iraq campaign, and then Afghanistan. And I should have said earlier on, back in 1991, I was part of 1st Armored Division in the First Gulf War, when we kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and then decided, in my opinion rightly, not to go on to Baghdad, not to go on to Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein at that point. But one of my maxims in life, one of the sort of mantras, is that all choices carry consequences, and that decision certainly carried big consequences in terms of Iraq. There's no doubt at all in my mind that probably a couple of 100,000 people died in Iraq as a result of that continuing regime under Saddam Hussein in those years. And I left the army in 2007, and looking back, it was fantastic. I was very lucky. And it sounds a bit pathetic really, but I loved every day of my military service. I served alongside a mix of international military, media, diplomats, civil servants, a whole mass of non-governmental aid organizations, UN agencies like UNHCR and others, and then increasingly over the last decade or so, many private sector players, particularly in the logistics world, contractors on operations, engineering, and so forth in those sorts of areas. And over those years, I saw the reality behind the headlines. And that reality was the gangsters, the protection rackets, places like Northern Ireland, greed, the desire for power, an experience of first-hand the religious, ethnic, and cultural bigotry divides our world, and the brutality that flows from it, dealing with Sunni, Shia, Protestant, Catholic, Turks in the north, Cyprus, Greeks in the south, and so on and so forth. And I can assure you that such bigotry is not one-sided. There are very rarely goodies or baddies in this business. And from it all emerged a couple of issues which might help set the context for my thoughts on being a Christian soldier. And first of all, it's important to say that there are no easy answers here. I'm telling you my story. I hope it's some interest and will help you understand why I made the decisions I did. But there will be people who see different aspects of the story and see that differently. That's perfectly fine and understandable. Nigel Bigger, some of you may have heard of, is a professor of moral and pastoral theology at Oxford, and I work with Nigel in various guises. He wrote a book called In Defense of War. And he says in that book, no human action or enterprise is pure or unblemished. Whilst this does not mean that no human action can ever be right, it does mean that no war between human beings will ever be just in a pure sense. We need to acknowledge that war will always be waged by one set of sinners against another. And it always causes terrible evils. And it always drags us ever be justified? That's one of the questions that Nigel poses in his book, and in a way, what we're about this evening. And second, and following on from this, when you've seen the terrible effects of terrorism and war, including, as I have, watched the mass graves being dug up in places like Iraq, the Balkans, words like sin and evil don't just remain interesting theological issues. They illuminate the stark reality of a broken and brutal world. And as a human being, never mind as a Christian, it inevitably left me, for one, questioning how exactly should we deal with that sin and that evil? Deal with people prepared to use any means to achieve their ends. Suicide bombers, ethnic massacres, indiscriminate terrorism, and the bloody combat that flows from that. How do we establish justice and deliver moral, ethical, and legal accountability in such a brutal world? And all of that lies within a paradox. What is it that the principal role of the British military, the reason it exists, is to deliver what we call in our doctrine, the Army doctrine, fighting power. That's why we exist, to deliver fighting power onto a battlefield, not to be nice. There are no prizes for coming second on a battlefield. The test is war and battle. The result is triumph or defeat. And the end result is that while some, like the British government, for example, would argue that the military can be a force for good, events in the real world have a habit of interfering, and there is rarely any certainty on how things will turn out, as Putin and Russia are finding out at the moment in Ukraine. A Canadian parachutist battalion had to be disbanded in disgrace when its soldiers lost self-control in Somalia in 1993. And on that same operation, that same deployment, you may remember, a unit of US Army Rangers were overwhelmed and butchered, soldiers' bodies dragged through the streets in front of all of those watching on CNN. In Rwanda, in 1994, a small UN force led by a Canadian general, who I've met, and is an extraordinary guy, those forces had to stand by and watch as 800,000 people were massacred, not using modern weapons, but by machete and other means. And the Dutch troops in Srebrenica in 1995 had rules of engagement that didn't, in theory anyway, allow them to respond to serve ethnic cleansing. Many, of course, opposed operations in Iraq in 2003. But in Syria, tens of thousands of people died as the world watched, apparently powerless to do anything about it. And in that context, maybe the answer is, it's all too difficult. Let's just stay out of it. In such a complex world of chaos and uncertainty, can there ever be such a thing as a just war? And should Christians be involved? Or should we simply stay out of it all, leaving it up to others to resolve the mess, and then joining in the chorus of criticism from the touchline when it all goes wrong? Remembering that I was a 30-year-old captain in 1981 when I became a Christian, my first decision had to be, can I stay or should I leave? And that sort of took a certain amount of time, as you can imagine, in conversation with good friends, Christian friends and others, studying the scriptures, praying, and trying to decide what the right action was. Now, leaving aside the fact that Jesus, of course, used force to clear the temple of the money changers, he gives the Pharisees and the teachers of the law a pretty hard time in the Gospels. And he declares in Luke chapter 12 that he didn't come on the earth to bring peace but division. There are various passages that I just want to look at, which in the New Testament that refer to the military in particular. In chapter 3 of Luke's Gospel, you remember the story of various people going to John the Baptist when he was baptizing people at the River Jordan. And one of those groups of people were some young soldiers. And they, like others, said to John the Baptist, what must we do to be saved? And I always think John the Baptist gave a rather unfortunate answer. He said, be content with your pay. And what he was saying to them basically was, don't abuse your power. He didn't say, leave the military. Matthew chapter 8, you probably remember the story that Jesus meets a centurion who asks for his help. His servant is paralyzed and in terrible suffering. And Jesus says to the man, I will come to your home and I will heal your servant. And the centurion says, no, we don't need to go anywhere. I'm a soldier. I tell people what to do. I say, come here, and they come. I say to people, go there, and they go. He said to Jesus, all you need to do is give the word of command, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus, we're told, is astonished at what he hears. And he says to those following him that he hasn't found anyone in Israel with such great faith. And he then proclaims that many outsiders will take their place at what he calls a feast in the kingdom of heaven. And the centurion's servant, of course, is healed. In Mark chapter 16, we read of a centurion at the crucifixion who declares that Jesus was surely the Son of God. And the whole of Acts chapter 10 is taken up with the story of Peter baptizing a centurion called Cornelius, who was a member of the Italian regiment, together with his family. I haven't got time to go through the whole story, but in simple terms, Peter goes to this family, baptizes them. Probably the first non-Jewish Gentile family baptized into the Christian faith. So there was something fundamentally flawed being a soldier, as he was. Then why would the good Lord have taken Peter and used him to baptize that family in that way? And later in Acts, Paul talks of a centurion from the imperial regiment showing him kindness on the journey by sea to Rome, and then sparing his life after they were shipwrecked. And Paul in his letters, if you read letters, particularly the letter to Timothy, which you might be surprised is one of my favourites, or a couple of my favourites, he uses a lot of soldierly language. So the bottom line is that nowhere are soldiers condemned for being soldiers, or told that they must leave the military. Indeed, the opposite seems to be the case. Now, many Christians, particularly Christian pacifists, would argue that we shouldn't rely on those sorts of examples. Our only example must be Jesus, who, so the argument goes, is a pacifist. And more importantly, he destroys the idea of a just war in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, that's a perfectly understandable and valid opinion to hold, but I have to tell you, I'm not quite so sure that it's correct. In chapter 10 of Luke's Gospel, Jesus does famously tell his disciples that they should go out as lambs amongst wolves, without a purse or bag or sandals, as workers in the harvest field. And throughout the Gospels, Jesus himself heads purposefully for the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing full well what is going to happen to him, and knowing that he must refuse to allow his disciples to use force to stop him being crucified and protect him. But less often quoted, later on in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, Jesus actually reverses those earlier instructions. In chapter 22, verse 36, at the Last Supper, in the upper room, right before the crucifixion and his arrest, he says, but now, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And the disciples, one of the disciples says, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. To which Jesus replies, that's enough. Now, some say that Jesus' call to find a sword was somehow heavily ironic, or that he spoke in frustration or figuratively. But I have to be honest, I'm a pretty simple soul, and I have to believe that what Jesus says is what he means, and he means what he says. And sometimes ago, I exchanged emails with Nigel Bigger, the chap I referred to earlier, about this verse. And he replied, I confess I've never thought about this before. The meaning may seem obscure, but any skepticism about just war's significance only works if Jesus was speaking figuratively. That is, that he didn't really mean to take the 2 swords. If he meant what he said, then that is one reason not to accept that Jesus was a pacifist. So if Jesus was leading a movement where non-violence was a critical article of faith, it seems to be inconceivable that his followers would be carrying swords into the upper room for the Last Supper the night before the crucifixion, and then carrying them with them into the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of his arrest. do appreciate that others will have a different perspective. Maybe that will come out during the questions, indeed a different thought. But for me, it is too easy to argue that an unjust peace is better than a just war. I had this conversation with a professor on a radio program. He was sitting in a study in Oxford and said, better an unjust peace than a just war. And I said, Professor, that's easy for you to say, sitting in your panelled study in Oxford University. You're not the one with bombs being dropped on November or blown up on the streets of Northern Ireland, or etc., etc. Peace sometimes permits terrible evils to reign. And as I said earlier, all choices carry consequences. And choosing not to go to war has serious consequences that need justifying too. Jesus told Peter to put away his sword in John's Gospel and added in Matthew, of course, that all who draw the sword, live by the sword, shall die by the sword. And throughout history, there have been numerous organizations that have drawn and lived by the sword. The Nazis, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Milosevic, Saddam, ISIS, the list rolls on. But it seems to me that we can all too easily fall into the trap of wishful thinking. Allowing such evil to reign is not simply an easy thing to do, it's not sweet innocence, if you like. Whilst we live in freedom and democracy, the harsh reality is that large numbers of people exist under the thrall of non-democratic regimes and dictatorships. And their leaders of those countries do not hesitate to use force as and when they feel the need. Choosing when and where to use the sword against these regimes clearly isn't easy, and politicians have to make tough choices, knowing they're going to get a lot of criticism, whatever choice they make. But the problem with a pacifist position is it does require the rest of the world essentially to leave them alone. A perennial weakness because sadly the world doesn't tend to leave us, or more importantly, others, alone. Even the Mennonites abandoned their pacifist principles in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, fighting back in the end against the brutality that has been leveled against them, still controversial even today. And the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr warned in the 1930s, pacifism either tempts us to make no judgments at all, or to give an undue preference to tyranny. Pretty powerful statement, but I have to say I've seen that reflected over the years that I've served. So the bottom line is, that process that I pulled through, which I worked my way through in 1981, 82, led me to the view that pacifism wasn't for me. I came to the conclusion that in the same way that we need a police force in this country to capture the burglars, deal with murders, like this young 7-year-old girl who was killed in Liverpool recently. And sometimes those policemen need to enforce the law, if necessary using force. So there are times when the international community needs to use force as well, needs to enforce the law, the international law. So I decided to stay. The next question was, okay, if you're staying, how then do you live out your Christian faith in the military? What does that look like? And there were two particular passages that I found helpful as I tried to work my way through this. First one is Joshua, and we were chatting, Dave and I were chatting earlier on. I mean, the book of Joshua is a pretty violent book, as we all know, as he takes the promised land. But there's a lovely story at the beginning of Joshua, the book of Joshua, I think it's about chapter 5, chapter 6, where before the battle of Jericho, Joshua is on his own, preparing for the battle, preparing to fight the next day. And we're told that he meets a man dressed in armor. And I have to say, I have every understanding of what Joshua's doing here. I mean, I've been there myself prior to places like Iraq and Northern Ireland times and so forth. As a leader, as a commander, you just take yourself away and you ask yourself some really serious questions. Are we doing the right thing here? Am I going to survive? Will I live? Will we win? How are we going to engage? So Joshua's standing there, meets this man dressed in armor, and he asks the man a very sensible question. He says to him, are you on our side or are you on their side? And if you remember the story, some of you may remember the story, the man replies, human terms, having been there myself, if I'd found something like this, my natural reaction would have been to call the Sergeant Major, arrest the bloke, and put him in prison properly. But Joshua asks this man what the Lord's commands are. And he gets, if you remember the story, he gets the most ridiculous battle plan. The guy says, right, what I want you to do is march around Jericho 7 times over 7 days, blow some trumpets, the walls will fall down, it'll be fine. And Joshua must have thought, this is crazy. This is not going to happen. But he does what he is told by this guy, who he believes, and we read, is the commander of the Lord's army. He has been sent by the good Lord to give Joshua these instructions. And the result is, as we all learned at Sunday school, as many of us have learned at Sunday school, that the walls come tumbling down. And for me, there's lots of issues in the story, but for me, the key issue is God is not a mercenary to fight on my behalf. He's not an Englishman or an American or anybody else. The question is not, is God on my side as I go into battle, but am I on God's side? Am I trying to bring justice and righteousness to this situation? Are we aiming to use force in that way, or are we simply trying to apply brutal force in some sort of conquest? Some sense. It's why the story of Joshua is so interesting. The second story is in the book of Judges. It happened about 3,000 years ago. You may remember the story again. The Hebrew nation is being attacked by a very aggressive nation, the Midianites, and to defend themselves, they assemble an army, 32,000 strong, under Gideon's leadership. And as he prepares to go into battle against the Midianites, Gideon asks another very sensible question. He bends down and prays and says, Lord, are we going to win? Are we going to win this battle? And God says to Gideon, yes, you're going to win the battle, Gideon, but there's a problem. Gideon says, what's that? God says, your arm is too big. God says, I want you to assemble the army and tell them that if they don't fancy the fight, they can go home. So Gideon assembles 32,000 people, tells them they're going to have a fight. If they don't fancy the fight, they're allowed to go home. 22,000 of them look at their watches and decide it's time for tea. They leave 10,000 behind. Still too big, says God. Take them down to the lake, get them to drink. And those who bend down and lap the water like a dog, send them home. And those who reach down and lift the water in their hand and bring the water to their mouth, you can keep them. Actually, a pretty good military principle. Because if your head is down looking at the water, they're not looking around you, finding out, trying to see where the enemy is. Whereas if you're standing up and bringing the water to your mouth, you can look around and see what's going on. 9,700 of them kneel down and lap the water like a dog. Gideon is left with 300 people. He then goes on to fight what we would today call a brilliant maneuver warfare battle. The Midianites basically destroy themselves. Gideon puts people on the high ground, they break some lamps, break some jugs, make lots of noise. The Midianites think they're being attacked, or they are being attacked, and they, as I say, basically destroy themselves. So what's going on here? Reduction from 32,000 to 300. I use this example quite a lot, and normally somebody at the back of the room shouts out defense cuts. But that's not what it's about, I don't think. It's something in the script that runs through the scriptures. It's in Zechariah. In fact, it's written on that banner as you come through the door on the right-hand side. Not by might, nor by strength, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. This is not about numbers. It's not about power in an earthly sense. It's about justice and righteousness and by God's Spirit. So the clear message for me was that I was to do my best to serve under the direction of the Spirit of God, using my gifts and my talents to bring about justice and righteousness into a broken, sinful, and fallen world. And in doing so, remember it's not about numbers, but it's about God's Spirit. Which brings me to my final point. If we ask the question, can a Christian serve in the military? I think we must also ask the question, Would the military better, particularly the British military, be better if there were no Christians in it? Do we think that the British Army would be a better place if there were no Christians serving in it? As I mentioned earlier, the purpose and measure of the military is to deliver fighting power. And at the heart of fighting power is the will to win, the determination to succeed against all the odds. And actually we're seeing that will to win in spades in the Ukrainian military as against the Russian soldiers, who clearly don't have that strong will to win. And we put that comment under the umbrella of what we call the moral component of fighting power. How do we get people to fight and be prepared to die on a battlefield if necessary? And fighting power is morally based because all contact and activity between people is always morally charged. Sometimes only slightly, but often substantially. It's very difficult to calculate. You can't count it like tanks and aeroplanes that I referred to in the Cold War years. It's different to that. It rests, I think, ultimately on character. The key differentiator between a good army and the brutal army. Take away character and you are left with pure militarism. Character provides the underpinning framework for justice and righteousness. They're determined to adhere to codes of behavior, to follow the Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, and crucially to face up to the reality that we, the British Army, like any other organization, is made up of flawed human beings who get it wrong. And when we do get it wrong, we need to acknowledge the reality of that. That's what separates out the good army from the brutal, between an army that uses the power to be a force for good and a destructive one that abuses that power. The problem is that our so-called civilization is covered with a thin varnish. Scratch it and underneath you find usually fear driving things. Democracies have to preserve the coat of varnish in a good state of repair because operating outside the law and the moral code, outside of an ethical framework, always scratches the varnish. So we in the military need to stand firm against scratching that varnish too deeply. Military is not driven by fear. But character can't be taught or legislated for or bought. At its heart, as Aristotle taught it, character is a habit, the daily choice of right instead of wrong. It's a moral quality. Grows to maturity in peace, and it's not suddenly developed at the outbreak of war. Our fate on the battlefield or in the battlefield of the business in life, the city and elsewhere, is worked out long before the crisis breaks out, long before the war begins. Character is the inner core that makes anyone or anything what it is, whether that's people or wine or a period in history. It's deeper and different from concepts like personality or image or reputation. It's the core reality in which our thoughts and words, decisions and behaviors are rooted. It defines who we are and it determines our behavior. It's who we are and what we get up to in the dark when we don't think anybody's watching. It's a great definition. Character is who we are and what we get up to in the dark when we don't think anybody's watching. And if the British military is going to maintain a strong moral component, then I, for one, would argue it desperately needs Christians throughout the military, in all its ranks, but particularly in its senior ranks, to give a clear sense of personal identity, a strong sense of purpose and mission, all the things that help us through tough times. So can a Christian serve in the military? I think so. Indeed, I think and would argue that they must. We need Christians everywhere, in politics, in business, education, the media, the police, the judiciary, as David and I were saying earlier on this evening, even in banking, and especially in the military. And I would add that we could probably do with a few more in the non-military organizations that deal with issues like the beginning and end of life, and many others like them. We need men, Christian men and women, to influence our decision makers, to stand up and be counted in every aspect of life, and to stand firm when the situation gets tough. 22. That's me.
Can I have this one on for just a moment, please? Thanks, Tim. You've given us so much to think about so far. Before we move into questions, can I just outline a few ground rules for the question time? May we have genuine questions, please, not statements of personal opinions. Please keep them as brief as possible. That will allow plenty of other people to have a go to ask a question as well. And we appreciate that this kind of topic, some may hold very strong views about it. What I'd ask, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, that we count on everybody to observe the normal courtesies both to our speaker and to one another. Now, Nick is going to... Where's Nick? Right. Nick has got a microphone and he will bring it to you, and I will endeavour to point him in the right direction if he misses it. But to begin with, where are you?
I did a flanking movement because I have a sense of what's coming.
Yes, yes, I've got a question, please, Tim. Now, I think it was in your last but one slide, you mentioned 4 components about being a Christian in the military: fearing God and doing what is right, and seeking justice and righteousness. Now, at times, in the heat of battle particularly, it must be very difficult to strike the balance between those various elements and the harsh military realities that you're facing at that particular moment. Can you outline the situation or situations where you've been presented with particularly difficult dilemmas, and at that particular time you've got to try to do the right thing? How have you approached it?
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you heard from my background, I've done quite a few military tours, operational tours around the world. I think in the context of the question, I'd go back to Kosovo. The initial deployment to Kosovo was what we thought was going to be a peacekeeping deployment. And peacekeeping, rather like Cyprus, peacekeeping is where both sides agree there's a peace that needs to be kept. You as a peacekeeper don't get involved in any violence, you simply observe what's going on. And in classic UN peacekeeping, wearing blue berets and reporting back to the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations. So we thought we would go into some sort of equivalent of a peacekeeping operation. At the time, there was a peace conference going on in a place called Rambouillet in France, which we thought would be the equivalent of what happened at Dayton, which brought about the end of the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans in the mid-1990s. And Tony Blair, who was then the Prime Minister, decided to deploy 2 brigades to Macedonia in preparation for moving into Kosovo. And I was commanding one of those brigades. We went in through Thessaloniki in Greece, we moved up through Greece into Macedonia, and we deployed around Skopje, the capital, which was about 10 kilometers from the border with Kosovo. And we prepared to go in. Milosevic did not agree to any peace plan in Rambouillet. Rambouillet failed. And you may remember NATO started bombing Serbia, and there was a lot of air activity. So basically, war broke out. I was commanding the brigade, as I say, and it's a long story, but as this happened, an American who worked for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees came up to me. He found me, I don't know how, I would say that the good Lord was involved in this, and said, can you come with me to the border? I need to show you what's going on at the border. And at the border with Kosovo, there were tens of thousands of people who were being dumped at the border by the Serbs. They were being kicked out of the capital, Pristina, and many other towns and villages. They were knocking on the doors literally at night and saying to people, if you haven't left here by the morning, we will kill you. So people were having to leave overnight very quickly. And there were tens of thousands of people, as I say, on the border. It was raining, it was cold, they had no food, no shelter, and they were beginning to die. And Joe said to me, I've got a team of 10 people, and I've got no way of looking after these people. Can you help? Joe was a classic NGO man, non-governmental organization. He told me afterwards he hated asking the military to get involved in this. But he said, I've got nowhere else to turn. I went back to my brigade headquarters. I told my chief of staff, I think we're going to get sucked into this, whether we want to or not. At the same time, almost literally about 2 or 3 days later, I got a phone call from the Macedonian Foreign Secretary. Now, how he found me, I have got no idea, and this is not an exaggeration. I was literally standing in the field, the phone rang, and he introduced himself. And he said to me, if I allow these people in across the border, can you guarantee that you can look after them and not allow them to go anywhere else in Macedonia? Which may sound harsh, but at this stage we need to remember that every other country from Yugoslavia, when it broke apart, had a civil war. And there'd been the ethnic cleansing and all sorts of things going on. And he did not, and the president of Macedonia did not want a civil war. So they'd already had quite a lot of people coming across the borders. He wanted somebody to guarantee that they would not, that we would look after them, that we would contain them. So I'm standing in this field on my own. The military imperative at this stage is to prepare to invade Kosovo. We were planning to have to fight our way into Kosovo. Which brings me to the situation. It was Easter weekend, funnily enough, 30 years after I'd become a Christian, Easter weekend. And I found myself thinking, militarily, actually, there is a military imperative here, because if we don't get involved, then I think there is going to be a major problem, and there could well be a civil war. So there was a military imperative. But there was also a humanitarian imperative. There was a justice imperative. Somebody had to look after these people. And there was nobody else, in effect. So I found myself saying over this on the phone, literally just saying to him, yeah, it'll be fine. Went back to my brigade headquarters and said, I don't quite know how we're going to do this, but we're about to start looking after about 30,000 refugees. Now, I had in my brigade logisticians, engineers, medical people, and all sorts of people. And we built and ran refugee camps for about 3 months, both in Macedonia and actually in Albania, as it turned out. Now, it'd be nice to say that like Joshua, I fell on my face and prayed. The truth is I didn't. The truth is it was a natural, instinctive response to what was being called upon. But I genuinely believe it was rooted in the fact that as a Christian, that was the right thing to say. And I would add that a lot of people didn't agree with me. Senior officers in the headquarters of KFOR told me within 24 hours this was a very bad decision. We were fixing my brigade to deal with this refugee problem. We were supposed to be planning to invade Kosovo, and you are going to be restricting our ability to do that. And for about 3 days, I genuinely didn't know whether I was about to be sacked or not. Mike Jackson, who was commanding KFOR, came to see me. I happen to know Mike very well from previous things. And he came about 2 days later and said, this is absolutely the right decision. What do you need to help? And everything was fine. And as a result of it, I got my C.B.E. But for that 24, 48-hour period, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of chaos. But I'm convinced it was the right decision to make, and I'm convinced that it was rooted in the fact that justice and righteousness, not be driven by fear, and the good Lord will sort it. And he did.
Thank you, Tim. Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Thank you, Tim, for sharing so clearly and for your service and commitment to defending humanity, as in Kosovo. Really appreciate that. One of the things you touched on was the development that we see in the Old Testament of not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. And I just want to carry that further and say, do we not see a development further and further until we come to the Lord Jesus Christ, God incarnate, and what he declared from that Sermon on the Mount. And you did list quite a few texts, which I could debate every one of them, but and that would take a whole evening. But what we do ignore is the fact, although you saw the, you took them to mean you needed to be involved in the military, the early church did not. And for the first 350 years or so, and clearly I've just got Ronald Sider's new book, The Early Church on Killing, which also deals with abortion and capital punishment. But it's not ambiguous, as some historians would say. There were some people who didn't follow the teaching of the early church fathers, but the teaching was unambiguous that you cannot be involved in killing. But I would put the rider that the military, of course, was much more than just a killing machine. And as you said, justified force, the police and so on, doesn't necessarily involve killing. So I would ask, what's my question? I must have a question here, because otherwise I've got no justification for saying anything. But can you actually believe that Jesus' approach would have ever been himself to take the sword, because he said to his followers, take up the cross and follow me? That wasn't just a metaphor, it was literal. They paid for it dearly, and their families and loved ones, as they followed Jesus. And the church never grew like it did then, since it became Christianized by Constantine, made into the official religion by Constantine.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, clearly, as I tried to, I think I made it fairly clear. I absolutely understand that we can read the scriptures and interpret scriptures and so forth differently, and we can look back at church history in particular, at the circumstances at the time. One of the things I think is really important, and again, you can play this both ways really, but is whenever we read a text, is to understand the context of the text. As somebody once said, taking a text out of its context is a pretext. And as we look at the scriptures, we do need to try and see the context of the whole. So when we read Paul's letters, we need to understand what the church that Paul is writing to in the context of the New Testament. And we read those scriptures that I referred to and got to see them in that broader context. And there are lots of other scriptures we could have used. It wasn't an easy decision, in inverted commas, to stay. But at that stage, in a way, I'm going to slightly repeat myself, but at that stage, having seen... it always surprises people how many Christians there are in the military. Quite a lot. A lot of senior officers are Christians, very committed Christians, and a lot of young soldiers are too. And it's not easy for being a young soldier. It was never difficult for me as an officer, but it's not easy being a young soldier. But it's partly because they look around them and say, "What is going on here? Why are people doing this to each other?" The early church believed that Jesus would come back pretty quickly, and that the new heaven and a new earth, Revelation and so forth, John's vision and prophecy and so on. As that didn't happen, they began to realize that that's the world, that we live in a broken and fallen world. And people then had to decide how they're going to deal with that. And there have been communities who've said, we are not going to act in any sense to respond to violence. And I can understand why people want to be in that position. And I genuinely respect it. And I think it's really important that in today's world we have people who are genuinely pacifist and are prepared to speak out. When I briefed Tony Blair prior to the Iraq War, Bishop Peter Price, who's a good friend of mine, was with other Christian leaders, was also briefing him, trying to get him to understand, what potentially was going to happen here. They didn't have all the answers, but they had some pretty good questions, and they had some pretty good ideas of, he'd been to El Salvador, he'd lived in Northern Ireland, he'd seen all sorts of stuff. So we need that collection of people to engage in this. But the honest truth is that ultimately, when I watched the mass graves being dug up, when I saw the ethnic cleansing in these places, I just felt that justice and righteousness is important. It's not good enough to walk away and say, well, look, there's nothing I can do about it. Because collectively we can. So that was the decision that I made. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount and other things that Jesus says about being peacemakers and so forth are really important. And I study that and I think about it, I reflect on it, and I try to live my life as best I can alongside those principles as well. But the bottom line is, I'm not a pacifist, and that's just the way it is. And when I kneel before the throne of grace, the good Lord isn't going to be interested in whether I was a general or whatever. The only question I'm going to be asked is, what do you think of my son? Christ died for me, for my sins. I'm a sinner, as Paul says, bigger than most. But that's all. That's what we have to hold firm to, and do our best to live to that best we can. And we get it wrong on a regular basis, all of us, obviously. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely understand your point.
Fortunately, hello, can you hear? Okay, fortunately, I'm in agreement with much of what you said. One of the big tensions which you didn't allude to is that your first loyalty is to the government of the day, although it's said to be to the Queen, and inevitably human beings get things wrong, so sometimes you've got to accept that it'd be very difficult to serve God if the decision is wrong or based on lies to go to war. I hope you never had that situation in your mind, but it will happen to soldiers.
Thank you. No, it not only will, it does. I was not in Northern Ireland in the early 70s, but a friend of mine who was a Christian resigned from the army over the decision for internment, which he believed was fundamentally wrong, and he was involved in the Operation Motorman that brought that about. So there are times when, as a soldier, you are faced with those sort of choices, and you do have to make a decision. I mean, I'll go back to your opening shot. It is not a sort of simple thing to say. My commissioning certificate was to the Queen, not to a party or a political party that's here today, gone tomorrow. It was to the head of state, Her Majesty the Queen. Now, of course, she didn't decide whether or not we were going to go into Northern Ireland or Kosovo or the Balkans or whatever. But it's an oath that people take extremely seriously in the military, you know, certainly from my perspective. So, you know, that is who if you like, my commander-in-chief, secular, human sense. But be under no illusion. My commander is the good Lord. I am under the authority of God. He is the commander. One of the key things about the Joshua story is Joshua has to make a choice. Am I in command of this army, or is God in command? And the answer was, God is in command. He obeyed the orders that he was given. How that happened in the context of the story and so forth, we can have a conversation about. But ultimately, I genuinely believe that my commander is the good Lord. Revealed to me through Scripture, revealed through Christ. You know, difficult choices, not always clear what it means, but often pretty clear. I've never been faced with a situation where I thought, I can't do this. I mean, I've referred to Iraq a couple of times. I briefed the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, Jack Straw, Claire Short, who I'll happen to have lunch with next week, later on this week. You know, these are leaders in very difficult situations trying to make difficult choices. I was asked to attend, there's a club in London called the Frontline Club. It's where all the war correspondents go and have lots of drinks. Martin Bell, you remember Martin Bell, the MP, in his white suit? His white suit is in a cupboard, in a glass cupboard in the Frontline Club. They held a debate, which I was asked to go and speak at, which was that Tony Blair should be harangued as a war criminal. And I was defending Tony Blair in inverted commas. Now, I have met Tony Blair quite a lot for various reasons, and I certainly don't agree with everything that he did by any manner of means. But the idea that Tony Blair should be on the same aeroplane as Milosevic, or Karadzic, or Mladic, or Stalin, or Hitler, it's ludicrous. I mean, he had some tough choices to make, and made choices on the basis of the context of Rwanda, and Kosovo, and Iraq, and what was happening to the Kurds, and what was happening to the Marsh Arabs, and so on and so forth. He tried to go along with what he saw as the right answer. Now, lots of people disagree with him, including my own daughter, who marched in London alongside a million other people and disagreed with him. But I didn't feel, in that situation, having briefed him and having gone to Washington and ended up going to Baghdad, I never felt in a position where I thought, I just cannot agree with this. My job was to recognize these are difficult choices and then do everything I could to do the best that we could. Well, then there's only two choices. You either get on with it or you leave. And thankfully, I serve in the British Army where I can resign, or I don't now, but I could have resigned, and people have done so. Going back to the guy I was mentioning in Northern Ireland. So people have curtailed their careers. They have decided to leave. And that's the only choice you've got. You can't take an oath of allegiance to the Queen to serve the nation and so on, and then say, well, I'm not going to go along with this. It's not up to me. I didn't wake up in the morning and decide to take my brigade to Kosovo. I didn't wake up in the morning and think I'll go to Northern Ireland or Cyprus or the Gulf or wherever. I was sent there by a government elected by the people in a democratic nation, and thank God that's the nation that I exist in. Russian soldiers today are having to make that choice, and many of them are heading for the border, and I don't blame them. So it's a serious point, and I absolutely acknowledge the reality of it. But we do, at the end of the day, one has to make that choice as to whether I think this is right or wrong. So I never had a problem with serving in Northern Ireland. We were dealing with some thugs. My first job in Northern Ireland as a bomb disposal operator was a restaurant called the Le Mans Restaurant. They had put a can of fuel with a bag of soap flakes and a can of and some plastic explosive on the wall at one end of the restaurant. They exploded it at 8 o'clock in the evening, around 8 o'clock in the evening, and like a napalm flame swept through the restaurant, killing and maiming ordinary people who'd just gone out to dinner. This was pre-planned mass murder. And I have no problem at all with saying I'm going to do what I can to stop that sort of thing happening. Peacekeeping in Cyprus, Iraq invades Kuwait, those are the sorts of operations that most of us are involved most of the time, and they don't call upon the difficult decision that you're alluding to, but sometimes they are. And there are times when people get it wrong. The way we treat prisoners on battlefields and, all of that. Every day there are decisions that need to be made to try to do what you're alluding to. So it's a good question. It's a serious question. Yep.
More questions, please?
Well, Christians suffer quite a lot in the military. I think of Hacksaw Ridge, amazing film of that young man who went in, who wanted to be in that regiment but not to carry a rifle. And I remember when I went into the Royal Air Force in 58, last for national service, the last intake I think it was, to 58 to 60, and I was appointed in charge of because I'd been in the ATC at school. Yeah. I was appointed in charge of the 22 men, and I remember how I was kneeling at my bed praying, and the NCO entered and everybody stood to attention, and I carried on praying. And this NCO came and stood right by me, and I carried on praying. I could feel his breath as he waited there to see what I would do, and I didn't do anything. I just carried on praying. So eventually he shouted out, "As you were," and marched out. Now I remember talking to one of the men about Christianity later on, and he said to me, "I could hit you if you weren't such a nice guy." And a lot of Christians did suffer because of their testimony to the Lord Jesus Christ. But I remember those particular things, and that film, Hacksaw Ridge, stands out in my mind as most decorated person in the in American forces. An amazing man whose whole object was to save the wounded, not to fight, and he kept going back again and again and again and rescuing people. And when the commander below saw all these wounded people, he said, "Who did this?" And I think his name was Doss. They said Doss has done it, and they were utterly surprised by it because he'd been the one they tormented when he was in the billet with them. That's really all I want to say.
I mean, Hacksaw Ridge is a film maybe not many of you have seen, but it is exactly that. It's about a guy who is called up and doesn't want to carry a rifle, given a really hard time by his platoon, but goes as a stretcher, basically, a stretcher orderly, and then does a number of extraordinary things and wins a huge number of medals. I mean, people often say to me, was it difficult to be a Christian in the army? And the honest truth is, it wasn't. Now, this was, I'm talking about the 1970s, 80s, and 90s and so on, not the national service days that you served in. And as I said earlier on, being a young private soldier is a lot different than being a captain and being a Christian and commanding my own squadron and battalion and so on. But I do think it's important to say that in that context, and I don't think it's any different in any other stream of life, in business, in politics and so on, my job was not to beat the soldier's head with a Bible and try to, in that sense, to convert everybody. My job was to be a good leader. And the motto of the Hat Badge of the Royal Military Academy is to serve, to lead, which is straight out of Philippians. Christ was the greatest servant leader there's ever been. And the Hat Badge at Sandhurst says that officers are to serve, to lead. So my job was to serve my young soldiers as best I could, and in doing so, earn their respect so that when things happened, they would have opportunities to share the gospel with them. And those occasions arose. As a result of the Kosovo operation, some years later, I was walking through London, and a young guy ran across the road, dodging the cars, grabbed hold of me and just said, "I just wanted to talk to you." He said, "I was with you in Kosovo. It's the best thing we ever did, and your Christian witness was really important to me." I had a letter from a young guy called Danny Crossman, who was with me as a captain. He wrote to me years later, said, "I'm now a vicar in Canada, and I want you to know that it was because of something you said when we were serving together in the Balkans." I got rung up by a young lady called Helen, whose marriage had broken apart. Her husband had deserted her, leaving her with a 2-, 4-, and 6-year-old, or a 4- and 6-year-old and a young baby, I think. And she said, I got through this because of something you said to me probably 20 years previously. Our job is to sow seeds, but in the context of our profession, to do the best we can to be a professional soldier, officer, RAF, banker, whatever, not to go around necessarily beating people over the head with a Bible. Now, it's easier as an officer to do that. And as I said earlier, there are a lot of British Army officers and indeed Air Force and Navy officers who are Christians. It's not so easy as a young private soldier. But that business of serving people and showing them what it means to be a Christian is part of this business of trying to do the best we can for justice and righteousness. It's about what we say. It's what we do when the chips are down, when the chaos is reigning. It's about stepping in and saying, that is not the way to treat people. Stop doing that. Look after those prisoners properly, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, we all fail on a pretty regular basis to get that right. But underlying it is the determination, the desire to serve Christ as best we can, in whatever capacity we're operating in. And that doesn't stop. I mean, I often do men's breakfasts, and forgive me, because quite a few people in here are fairly elderly, but I say, this doesn't stop. We're not done till we're dead. The wisdom we have as older people, with our young people around us, to talk to them and express what's going on and share stories with them, is crucial to sow the seeds. The message of the parable of the sower is that 75% of the seeds we sow will end up in rocky places and thorny places and go nowhere. But 25% of them will produce 30, 60, or 100-fold. So our job is to keep on sowing, to be good Christians in the environment where the good Lord has placed us, as best we can. And that example you quoted is not just a staggering story. The important thing is it's a true story. It really happened. Yeah.
So would you say it was vital to have chaplains in the army or in the services?
And actually, interestingly, so do a lot of non-Christians. Now, it's important to say the British Army is not a Christian army. My command, I've had Gurkhas under command, and I live in Aldershot, which got a lot of Gurkhas, there. So I had a lot of Gurkhas working for me. One of my regiments had something like 7 different cultures, people from Africa, West Indies, the Fijians, different faiths, Muslim, Hindu, and so Jew, Christian, and so forth. So it's not a Christian army, but having chaplains or padres is absolutely crucial. Now, a good friend of mine who was not a Christian was asked to do a study about 20 years ago now, looking at the chaplains department. And his recommendation at the end was we should increase the size of the chaplains department, not that we should get rid of it, which is what a lot of people thought he was going to come up with. And interestingly, in the context of the earlier question too, the greatest number of double VC winners in the British Army are chaplains and medics. And the chaplains are, they're good and bad, inevitably, but they are, very brave, and they'll be with the soldiers in the front line, in inverted commas. But also, they are somebody that the soldiers, sailors and airmen can go and sit down and talk to and open up with, and to say that they're afraid or they're missing their family or something's happening at home or they've had a Dear John letter to say that the wife or husband has gone off with somebody else. It's not true that there are no atheists in the foxhole. A lot of people say there are no atheists on a battlefield. That's not true. But I can tell you that all of the deployments that I was on, the chaplain would run services, not just on a Sunday, but all through the week, different times, because people are on duty at different times. And the tent was always pretty full. People on operation not just ask themselves some sensible questions, but they also recognize, I might not get out of this alive. And what does that mean for me and my family? Where am I going? What's eternity all about? And I think, to be honest, the non-military world, the police are not dissimilar to this in some respect. My youngest son works for the National Crime Agency, and they're doing some pretty difficult stuff. But for most people, that's not a question they like to ask themselves. So soldiers are faced with difficult situations, they're faced with difficult questions, and they need people to talk with them. And then, ultimately, we need chaplains to bury people. Which, you remember the Falklands campaign, when the para chaplain, who I know well, conducted the service when H. Jones died and so forth. And those moments are crucial in maintaining that moral component of fighting power, giving people the determination to carry on, the will to win, and the preparedness to be the next one who might end up in the grave. I don't want to over-emotionalize it or over-dramatize it, but that is a reality. So chaplains are absolutely crucial. And finally, chaplain is the only person that is a brigade commander and a divisional commander. I commanded a division of about 30,000. The chaplain was the only person that I could go to and open my own heart, because I couldn't do it with the people under my command. I couldn't share with them my fears, concerns, uncertainties, and so forth. Now, you don't just do it, or, you have to build a relationship with the chaplain, with the padre, and so forth. But I work with some brilliant chaplains, and they're absolutely crucial. And I would add that I have no problem with the fact that people say we should have secular atheist chaplains. If some soldier doesn't want to go and talk to the padre, but he wants to talk to somebody with wisdom and is prepared to share with them, that's fine by me. I would argue that he hasn't got the same offer on the table. I don't know how they talk about the fact, okay, well, if you die tomorrow, this is what's going to happen and so forth. But soldiers, sailors, airmen, difficult situations need somebody they can talk with and to think about the big questions. And the chaplain provides that capability. So it's very important. I think it's almost time for a beer.
Just have one more go, please. Could I have the mic, please? Tim, over dinner we touched briefly on the nuclear question, and basically what I was hinting at was that given the uniquely destructive power of nuclear arms, do you think that the prospect of nuclear warfare poses particular difficulties and challenges as regards Christian armed services involvement?
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, I think it does. My eldest son, Alexander, was a Royal Naval officer, submariner, served as a weapons engineer on nuclear submarines, including in one tour that he did on one of the nuclear delivery submarines, the Trident submarines, as a strategic missile officer. So it's an issue that, from a family point of view, we've obviously thought about, and he's obviously thought about. I mean, again, you know, we could spend a long time looking at this issue, but if we put it in the context of some of the things I said, and one's got to be careful about how one says this, because there's an argument in America, for example, over gun law and all this sort of stuff, but it's not weapons that kill people, it's people that kill people. 800,000 people died in Rwanda, not because of nuclear weapons, or machine guns, or tanks, or aeroplanes, or anything else. They died because people picked up a machete and hacked them to death, including, in some cases, their own families, children, wives, husbands, and all sorts of things. That is the nature of sin. So the weapon is not incidental, but is not the central issue. The central issue is the fallen nature of mankind. And we could talk about that, obviously, in many ways, for what it's worth. For me, the Garden of Eden, the story of the Garden of Eden, is Adam and Eve saying to the good Lord, I'll be my own boss, thank you very much. Don't tell me what I can eat and can't eat. I'll make my own choices. And that's what we all do every day, and that's what happens in, you know, various places. So, you know, people die because they're beaten, killed in all sorts of ways. But there's no doubt that nuclear weapons are a particular class of weapon that we would all wish to see, in inverted commas, uninvented. And the fact that they haven't been used over the last 70 years since the end of World War II, you know, is in a sense a great tribute, if you like, to the international community as a whole. The situation in Russia at the moment is interesting. I've been doing quite a lot of stuff in terms of Ukraine and Russia. And for what it's worth, you know, Putin is not Milosevic or Saddam Hussein. He has the ability to initiate nuclear warfare. And I, for one, think that we need to be very careful about just assuming that this is a bluff and, you know, megaphone diplomacy that's going on through the media and all the rest of it. We need to relearn the lessons of the strategic deterrence that went on in the Cold War years. We used to talk about strategic nuclear deterrence under the umbrella of the acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And we convinced everybody that an exchange of nuclear weapons would lead to mutually assured destruction, and therefore they weren't used. What Putin is now saying is, well, you know, I would be prepared to start throwing some tactical nuclear weapons around. 2 kiloton, 5 kiloton, 10 kiloton. The Hiroshima nuclear weapon was a 15 kiloton weapon. So these are not, you know, these are not small weapons, even in the tactical sense. So we do need to be very careful. I think Putin could be prepared to do this. I don't think there's any doubt that he's going to announce that these republics or these provinces in the referendums have said they want to be part of Russia. He will then proclaim them to be Russian territory. And if the Ukrainians carry on, then he does definitely have not the probability, but certainly the possibility that he would use tactical nuclear weapons. So it opens up that whole piece. Would we in the West, with Germany and Italians and French and Poles and Hungarians, really want to get involved in nuclear warfare over 4 provinces of Ukraine? That's going to be the question that people are asking themselves. And I don't think Putin should get away with this, and I'm strongly in favour of continuing to, you know, provide the Ukrainians with the ability to defend themselves, going back to some of the stuff I've talked about already. But that issue, you know, are we really prepared to see exchange of nuclear weapons is a big, serious issue. So it's at the heart of your question. But it can't be uninvented. You know, the reality is they're there. So my answer is, I don't want to see nuclear weapons used. We do need to understand how deterrence works, and a chunk of that is uncertainty, and a large chunk of it is relatively quiet diplomacy and an ability to communicate with those who are capable and have got these weapons. And sadly, one of the lessons that Ukraine is teaching people is, when the Warsaw Pact broke apart, Ukraine agreed to give up all of its nuclear weapons, which it did. They're now being threatened with nuclear weapons. And a lot of people are beginning to say this is going to open up the fact that a number of other countries are going to say, well, we need nuclear weapons, because Putin wouldn't be threatening this stuff if Ukraine had got their own nuclear weapons. So I hope we don't go there. It is a different ball game. It is something that we need to take very, very seriously with the potential consequences. And we do need to understand how deterrence works and be prepared. We had, academics, politicians, military leaders studied and, really understood how deterrence worked back in the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s and 80s and 90s. Re-looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, how that turned out and the way that it operated. But I do come back to my starting point, which is ultimately we, you, me, are part of the problem. It's the fallen nature of mankind. It's how do we deal with people? How do we communicate with people? How do we take the heat out of situations? And I don't think that's helped. I don't think that's done by, as I say, megaphone diplomacy, by standing up and saying it's all a bluff, and if he tries it, we're going to throw everything at the kitchen sink at him too. I don't think that's very helpful.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure you'd want me to thank and express our appreciation to Tim for a talk which has been so interesting, informative and very thought-provoking for all of us. So we do appreciate your coming among us, and we appreciate everything you've said and the way in which you've answered this great range of questions as well. I'd like to express my thanks to other members of the committee who've contributed to running this meeting. Thank you also particularly to Mike Hayes, who's been operating the AV system at the back for us, and also Lex has been doing work on that as well. And of course to you for being here this evening. It's been good to see you all here. Our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday the 22nd of November, when Professor Ian Kimber, who's a toxicologist, is going to be speaking on ending animal experimentation, a realistic goal, ? Now, I think that looks like it's going to be another very interesting debate. Practical issues there, scientific issues, and of course, ethical issues as well. That's going to be held at the United Reformed Church, and full details will follow. If you're not already on our mailing list and would like to be, there's a clipboard on the table at the back for you to write your contact details. And any questions has now joined the digital age. As they say on the BBC, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube. Today's presentation has been live streamed, and we will ensure that the live stream also gets on our YouTube channel. Finance. Now, we offer these meetings entirely free of charge, but there are, of course, expenses involved in arranging them, and your contributions would be greatly appreciated, as they will enable us to keep our contributions going and invite speakers to come to us, who invariably don't charge for their services in doing their presentation, but often when there's very large distances involved, it's right and proper that we cover such expenses. So could I ask you please to give as generously you can as you leave, if you've not done so already. There are bowls on the tables at the back for this purpose. Thank you very much. Let's close with a prayer. We thank you, Lord God, for this Any Questions group and for the freedom we enjoy to meet together in this way to discuss matters of mutual interest and concern in the spirit of open inquiry and discovery. We thank you too for this presentation from Tim this evening and for his experience and wisdom in guiding us through this weighty topic. We ask for your continued blessing on him in his ongoing ministry for you. And for ourselves, Lord, as we reflect upon what we've heard this evening, both from Tim and from one another, we seek your wisdom and discernment in directing our thoughts aright. Guide us, Lord, always into the paths of truth. Amen. Thank you.